Three, so we'll get going. Thank you all for coming. I apologize if any of you showed up last week and didn't get my notification that it was canceled. It's been slightly crazy, to say the least. Doing both writing about Israel to the rest of the world and being on television here quite frequently about American politics. This has been one of the craziest 10 days, or however you define it, one can think of, frankly. Middle of the night appearances twice, although one got canceled, and plenty of other appearances. And also, for me, the first time doing a significant amount of television work in Hebrew, which has been interesting. In any case, 2-hour events. I don't even know where to begin, quite frankly. I guess we'll begin with the events of the last day and then work our way back, obviously. Obviously, everybody was surprised. Shouldn't have been shocked, but everyone was surprised that the Houthis successfully managed to infiltrate a drone into middle of Tel Aviv, quite frankly. I mean, one block in from the ocean, it's not exactly the middle of Tel Aviv, but quite to the center of Tel Aviv. The fact that it wasn't intercepted, it will go down. I mean, thankfully, the result, I mean, for one person, there's no coming back from this. He was killed, and that would be a forever tragedy. But beyond that, the damage was more to Israel's ego than physical damage. Some glasses were broken, apartments were messed up, but that was the extent of it, besides for the one death, which you can't take away from that in any which way. But the fact they did it was obviously a blow. We've had this repeated, and we'll get to that when I go talk to the north. The issue of the drones have been a bigger problem than they should be, in my opinion. When I say should be, because we should have learned from Ukraine. We should have been better prepared for drones, but we're not, and that's a whole other story. When the history of this war will go down in the list of mistakes that were made, one of them was not being prepared for drone warfare in the way that we should have been. But in any case, once the attack took place, it was clear that Israel was going to respond. It could not leave an attack on Tel Aviv unresponded. Now, there are all these people who say in Hebrew, Din Kiryat Shmona should be Din Tel Aviv, or Din Tel Aviv should be Din Kiryat Shmona, or Din Eilat should be Din Kiryat Shmona. And what they're saying is, well, since Kiryat Shmona has been attacked and we didn't destroy Beirut port, why are we doing it? Because they attacked Tel Aviv. Two reasons. And people, it's a sad thing to say, but the reality is Israel's economic lifeline is basically in the Tel Aviv metropolitan area, and it can't afford to lose that economic lifeline. It can't afford to go to the point again where all the airlines stop flying, the few tourists who are coming stop coming. Well, very few tourists coming, but we'll leave that part aside. But the business people stop coming, major corporations were already reluctant because of some of the boycott pressure, now start deciding Tel Aviv is too dangerous a place to put their new R&D center, et cetera, et cetera. Kiryat Shmona is not Tel Aviv, and that's the reality. But number two, if we could hit Beirut, where we hit the Houthis, and not have a response that we would get from Hezbollah, which we don't have, well, we have answers for, but not enough, then we would do it. But the reality is, if we hit Beirut, the Hezbollah is going to go to a full-scale war with us, and if they go to a full-scale war with us, the damages will be high, and we're not ready for that. We don't want that, and we don't want to have to go conquer Lebanon, which would be the only choice. It would leave us, and then the whole world would say, hey, you're conquering more territory. All those things will come into play. So in terms of the Houthis, it was a sort of, difficult from a logistics standpoint, but a relatively easy job. It's a distance that the Air Force has flown before. It's practiced this attack many times. It's practiced in Greece and practiced in Cyprus, and it has old tankers. The Israeli Air Force aerial tankers are old 707s that were originally flying for El Al years and years ago, and were converted into tankers. They were converted to tankers and used as transport planes. As a matter of fact, going back to when my eldest daughter was born, and she's over 40 at this point. I took one of those planes from Sharm el Sheikh, where I was in the reserve duty at the time, flew it back to Ben Gurion Airport to get back for the birth. And that was over 40 some odd years ago, and those same planes are still being used today as tankers. Israel's ordered modern tankers from the United States. It took a while to approve them, but they were approved about a year ago, a year and a half ago. But it's, at a certain point in the Boeing production line, and I think we're not going to get them for another 2 years. So we're using tankers that are probably 60 years old, maybe 55 years old. Pretty old planes are being used as tankers, but they still fly. They're maintaining them well. Israel Aircraft Industries specializes in maintaining old aircraft. So the actual logistics was a bit complicated. So we flew probably about 40 aircraft down there, but the targets were easy. It was in the middle of the day. We didn't do a nighttime bombing. It was a daylight bombing. The limited anti-aircraft missiles that the Houthis have more or less been taken out by the British and the Americans over the last 5 or 6 months. As a matter of fact, right now there are reports that the Americans and the British are attacking a port 40 miles to the north of where we attacked last night. The Americans did not attack this port, which is the main conduit for Iranian arms. The reason was because a lot of the food goes into this area via there, and the issue of relief work and everything else. And this goes down to one of these really difficult problems that exist in the world, which is most of these rube terrorist organizations are operating from some of the poorest places on earth, where the population is basically subsistence, and subsistence to some extent is a result of United Nations and other food aid that's being given to these countries. And so the United States did not destroy the port of Houthis, as Israel did yesterday, because it said, well, we don't want to limit the amount of food aid that goes around the country. So as to not allow the limited amount of food aid, we'll let the Iranians send in missiles and bombs and everything else to that port because we don't want to stop the food aid. Seems like it's a bit of a moral problem there, and the question is, and this goes back to a whole issue of using civilians, but this is a whole population that's being used, and the Houthis are sort of hiding behind their civilian population, but the civilian population is very much involved in their army. It's a very difficult moral dilemma, let's put it that way, but at some point you have to just say it doesn't provide you with a sanctuary completely. I mean, the Israeli attack hit very, very few civilians. It mostly all industrial targets, and I think maybe three people were killed, which is a remarkably low number for the amount of oil and everything else that was destroyed. The Houthis have promised retaliation, stronger retaliation. I mean, it's not like they haven't attacked us until now. Until now, they have fired somewhere in the area of over 200 projectiles at Israel, combination of ballistic missiles and drones. Some have been down by the United States, some by Britain, some by France, a fair number by Israel as well. But they've been firing all the time at us. It's not clear they have a capability of firing more than they've fired until now. So we'll have to see. They did fire one ballistic missile this morning in the early morning hours. That was intercepted by the Arrow 3 before it got anywhere close to Israel. They have, like I said, they're threatening additional responses. I will assume that our defenses are much better. We're doing something we should have done all along, which is air patrol off the coast, because that's the best way in order to see a low-flying drone is to see it from above, from an airplane that's flying that has look-down radar. So we're now finally doing that. It can be done without a problem on the coast. Along the northern border, it gets a little more complicated because the Hezbollah does have ground-to-air missiles. So far, they've been unsuccessful in attacking any Israeli plane, but it's much easier to attack a plane that's in a patrol format, going back and forth patrolling, than it is to hit a plane that's in attack mode and also does things to avoid being attacked. So that's part of the reason we probably do not fly these patrols along the northern border. Let's actually move to the north first, and we'll get to Gaza in a minute. look, we're in this stalemate with Hezbollah. There's all this talk again, we should attack, we should attack, we should attack. But anyone who understands our situation understands we don't want to attack. Because the Israeli government, I printed it a couple of days ago, but the Israeli government in black and white stated that we do not have enough tanks at the moment for the tank corps. Doesn't mean we don't have tanks to go into Lebanon. It doesn't mean we couldn't do it. It just means we're stretched. And you don't want to do a war with Lebanon when you're stretched. You want to do that war with Hezbollah when you are on your timing, when you want to do it. That timing may come. And if we don't manage to find a way of overthrowing the regime in Iran, that time will have to come at some point. But it doesn't have to come right now. And I go back to what I said 9 months ago and 10 months ago before the war. Israel needs to wait until its laser systems are deployed. We are 6 months away, somewhere in that area, from what I understand from deploying the laser systems. My sense is we've underreported what they can do. In other words, I think they're more capable than we're saying, not based on direct knowledge, but based on inference and indirect knowledge from some lectures and everything else I've heard. I think they'll be much more effective than people think, and certainly than the enemy thinks, and we should leave that as a surprise when the day comes. But we should also do our best not to get into an all-out war until they are available. We spent a lot of years and a lot of money developing this, and it's a really good solution, and let's hope it works the way we hope it does. But in the meantime, we're in a cat and mouse situation with Hezbollah. On one hand, it's been very successful. We're at a 40-to-1 ratio between Hezbollah fighters who we've killed versus how many they've killed. So for every one Israeli soldier or civilian that has been killed in the north, we have killed 40 Hezbollah soldiers. They care more about their soldiers than Hamas does. As a matter of fact, every one of their fighters who are killed, they print a picture, they do an obit, they have a big, funeral ceremony. They actually care about their soldiers to some extent. Hamas has never cared about their soldiers. They're just meat grinders, in the meat grinders, so to speak. So they care, but they're willing to take this in order to maintain their status as a successful enemy of Israel. The only one that's been successful in the sense that they've kept our people out of the area immediately along the border. The border areas remains evacuated, and some of the towns are getting more and more destroyed. Places like Metula, which is a beautiful village right on the border, is slowly but surely being destroyed day after day. Kiryat Shmona, a little same way. Shlomi, a little less so because of the geography. But some of the other kibbutzim along the border yet have been. They're saying that 10% of the people aren't going to come back to Kiryat Shmona. I mean, that's terrible, but okay. I am one, by the way, who never believed we should have cities along borders, but that's a different story. That's a whole view of what cities are supposed to do, and cities are not supposed to be military outposts in my mind. You can have kibbutzim as military outposts in small villages, but you don't have cities as military outposts. They become more of a target than they are as a military plus. But that's a whole other story. We have to go back to the 1950s in order to change that. But that was the tfisa in the 1950s, the approach in the 1950s, and that's why we ended up with cities like Kiryat Shmona. We ended up with Shlomi on the border. We ended up with Sderot on the Gazan border. And we've had other places as well. But today it's the way it is. Kiryat Shmona before the war was suddenly very successful over the last 10 years. And Kiryat Shmona had never been a very successful town. It turned into a much more successful town in the last 10 years with high tech going there, university going there. Tourism was very strong in the north. And so all those things were contributing to a blooming of Kiryat Shmona. Who knows what it'll take to get all that back. I think the internal tourism, the minute the war in the north ends, I think all of Israel will want to go up and visit the north, for better or for worse, just to be a part of and show our support. But we'll see what happens. That'll take some time. In Gaza, we are now basically, for the moment, only on the Philadelphia corridor, parts of Rafiah still, and in what's called the Netzarim corridor, which is the corridor in the middle of Gaza. We're operating from those two places, doing raids as well. The big question is there going to be a hostage deal or is there not going to be a hostage deal? By all accounts, everything is in place for a hostage deal. The deal is pretty much agreed to, with some small exceptions, and with some additional points that Netanyahu brought up in the last minute that weren't part of the original deal. No one quite knows what Netanyahu is going to do, because the reality is that if a deal comes, his government could easily fall, because Smotrich and Ben Gvir have both said that they are going to bring down the government if there's a deal. And Netanyahu's game seems to be to wait until his trip to the United States, or wait until right afterwards, if this is what he wants to do, bring a deal. And then the Knesset ends up in Pagra, which means it's off session, on vacation until after the Jewish holidays, which means for 3 months it's not officially not meeting. You can have an emergency meeting, but it's more difficult to do that, especially if the chairman of the Knesset is a Likud person. On top of which, Yair Lapid has said that for the purposes of a hostage deal, his party would provide an umbrella for the government, so that if the far right wants to bring down the government, they will not be able to, because the Lapid's party, the Yesh Atid, will come in and vote for the government in that particular case and keep it going through all the hostage negotiations, etc. It's so hard to know with Netanyahu what he wants to do. It gets even more complicated because his testimony in his trial, which he tried to delay until March, is now going to take place in December. In this crazy judicial system, his trial has been going on for 1.5 years, and just now the prosecution has finished its part of the trial. I mean, I won't even begin to tell you how insane that is, and it's not even because it only met once a week. It was meeting 3 times a week, but the Israeli justice system has some really, really big problems, not the ones that the people who wanted to do justice reform wanted to bring about, but these sort of problems that trials go on forever and ever and ever. In any case, the defense is going to begin its testimony starting in basically at this point in December, and it's supposedly going to start its testimony with Netanyahu's testimony. Netanyahu does not want to testify, because there are so many inconsistencies and lies back and forth between what he told the investigators at different times and what he said publicly at different times. And it's so very, very easy to catch him in lies, or he'd have to perjure himself and then be caught in lies. So he wants to do all he can not to testify. If I am him, I'm going to try to put this all off and then try to get a plea deal before the trial, and hope that he ends the war by then and can just, to some extent, do something for his reputation that was destroyed on October 7th. Whatever positive reputation he had was destroyed on October 7th. All polls show the overwhelming majority of Israelis want him to go. The overwhelming majority of Israelis think that he's the number one person responsible for October 7th, not alone, but he's the number one responsible, and he's the only person who hasn't taken responsibility. So I think we'll see that that in my mind, again, I'm not him, and getting into his mind is impossible. But if I'm him, that's the sort of thing that I would do, is try to get as far as I can in winning this war by then, try to do something for my reputation by at least getting home the hostages, and maybe getting the deal with Saudi Arabia, although I don't know it's still salvageable. And then doing a plea deal right before he'd have to testify. Plea deal would put him out of politics, but would also remove the chance of him going to jail. That would be the outlines of any sort of plea deal that's likely to take place. So that would be, in my mind, his timeline, which would mean beginning negotiate, giving an okay for the hostages as soon as he comes back from Washington, which is either Friday or maybe a little bit later. It's not clear right now because he's leaving a day late. But every part of the defense establishment, with the exception of some right-wing people, far-right people, thinks this is the only deal. There are people in this country, and they're a minority, but they're not an insubstantial minority, who think we should not go to this deal under any case. Under no circumstances should we give up, allow out terrorists with blood on their hands in return for getting back the hostages. They, frankly, they're basically saying it without saying it because they don't have the guts to say it. It's okay if the hostages die as long as we don't have to give up terrorists. That's the reality, and I would say probably something between 10 and 15% of the population supports that view of maybe a little bit more. That is the real view of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. They won't say those words, but that is the actual view that they have, because that's the only thing that can happen. If you're not willing to give up terrorists, and unless we were able to free them by military means, and if we had that capability, we would have done it already. There is no other choice. They're not going to give them up just because we say so. And they're only going to give them up in return for terrorists. Would it be less if we come up with a deal to save their lives? Maybe, but let's keep in mind, every day that goes by, the general expectation is there are less people alive. I mean, the one hostage I know personally, he's 82 years old. Yesterday was his birthday. How long can an 82-year-old man live in a cave underground with all the conditions that exist in Gaza right now? I do not know. But I wouldn't think very positively, not to mention bombs dropping nearby and everything that's involved in that. So, and just by accident, as I have an iPad down below with the news going, and just by accident, his picture is now on the screen of my iPad. So his son is talking and a picture of his father on the screen, Danziger. So, at any rate, that's where we stand with the hostage deal. Everybody in the military side all says make the deal, whatever negative military consequences we can deal with, but this is the only chance we have to get back the hostages at this point. And if we wait any longer, there won't be any hostages coming back. That's certainly my view. Every Saturday night, when you live in our neighborhood, you have to decide which demonstration you're going to go to, because there are basically 3 demonstrations or 2.5 demonstrations every Saturday night. You have a demonstration at the Kikar HaTafim, the hostage square, and you have a demonstration about 2 blocks away along Kaplan and Begin, which is the demonstration to bring down the government. The last 2 or 3 weeks I've been going to Hostage Square. Not that I don't want to bring down the government, but I think that's, the hostages right now are much more important than needed, and it's something that has to be done. And all public opinion polls show that at this point, I think it's somewhere like 69% of the Israeli public supports the current deal as understood, with the number that opposes it down to 18% at this point. That number was reversed practically 5 months ago, or 6 months ago, or 7 months ago. Back then, Israelis were optimistic that we would be able to rescue hostages. That's the reality. We all thought that once the ground operation got going and we're deep into Gaza, we'd manage to rescue some substantial number of hostages. We've rescued a few, but unfortunately very few. So at this point, most Israelis believe there's no choice. And also, again, these are people who's our responsibility. They're not even soldiers. These are people who were literally in their beds, asleep. I mean, some of the soldiers obviously too, but a large percentage of them, people in their beds asleep and were attacked, and we, the Israeli government, we, the Israeli army, were not there to protect them. And therefore, we need to do everything we can at this point. It's been 9+ months to get as many of them back as possible while they're still alive. Okay, I want to touch on the IRC report, the one that said that Israel's occupation was illegal and Israel should pull out and all those sort of things. I wrote about it last night to some extent. I think two things can be true at the same time. Some of the things that Israel does inside the West Bank probably violate international law. I say that probably. I'm not, I only took one course in international law way back when. Was a renowned scholar, but that was a long, long time ago. So I'm not an expert, but having followed this, there are things that we do that probably contravene some aspects of international law. Some of the settlements clearly contravene some aspects of the international law. That being said, the problem is that even if I was king tomorrow, and I personally don't want us to have any part of the West Bank, because I don't want that population, I don't want them to be part of us because there'll eventually be too many of them. If I was king, and I say king being that I have ultimate powers, I would not know how to get us out of the West Bank and ensure our security. That's the reality. Well, I've had before this war, I used to go up to some of the people who were demonstrating against what we were doing in the West Bank. Every week, a couple of blocks from my house. I pass them on Thursday nights often. And I engage them. I mean, some of the things they say I agree with. First of all, I believe that occupation is a terrible thing, and I think our occupation brings us to do terrible things, and I agree with them on that. But then I go to them, and I said to them, "Okay, what is it that how would you get us out of the West Bank now? What can you do to ensure the fact that we'll pull out of the West Bank and we'll be safe?" And the only thing one of them said was, "Well, we can pull out and we'll turn it over to the Palestinian Authority." And I said to him, if that's what you're selling to the Israeli public, and this is before October 7th, if that's what you're selling to the Israeli public, then you might as well just go home because you're never going to sell that. That's not a viable plan. Unfortunately, I have not seen a viable plan right now under the current circumstances. Now, the whole world wants a Palestinian state. Why does the whole world want a Palestinian state? Because to everybody, there's a solution, especially Americans. There's always a solution to every problem, right? We all know that. There's a solution to every problem. There must be a solution to every problem. Well, they're right. The only long-term solution to this problem is going to be a Palestinian state. The only problem is the Palestinians have never accepted a small Palestinian state as the solution. And until they do, and I don't know what it'll take for them to do it, and the things we could be doing and not doing, but I don't want to get into that right now. Until they do, it's not a solution. Because until they accept the concept that a Palestinian state will always be a small state, a relatively unarmed state that can't threaten Israel, until they accept that as the reality and that they're never going to go back to their homes and villages that have long ceased to exist, then any Palestinian state that will be created will be a danger to the existence of the state of Israel. And Israel won't do that. And the Israelis won't do that, no matter how many plans people come forth, whether it's from Biden or the UN Secretary General, whoever it might be, or of international courts. Israel is not going to commit national suicide. And even people who are considered pretty far on the left side of the Israeli spectrum do not favor that at the moment. People like me are against any additional settlements in the West Bank because I believe someday we will reach this point, at least I hope, in my grandchildren's time, where we can reach a peace settlement with the Palestinians and a Palestinian state can come into existence, and having more settlements in more places will just make it more difficult. But am I in favor of a Palestinian state anytime soon? No, because I don't believe they're willing to make the basic concession that would bring about a Palestinian state. And therefore lies the dilemma. The world can talk all you want about a Palestinian state. The Palestinians deserve self-determination, and they do. But they don't deserve self-determination at the expense of our self-determination. And no one can expect Israel to commit national suicide. And Israelis are not willing to commit national suicide. Of course, we do enough of that internally, but that's a whole other story. We've hit more than the halfway point, so I'm going to open up the questions. I didn't touch on things like the ultra-Orthodox draft and those sort of things, So I'll be happy to answer that if anyone's interested. So put up your hands or whatever, and if I don't see you, hopefully my wife will tell me to call on you. No questions from anybody. Yeah, there we go. Ria, I can see you. Unmute yourself. Nope, you're still muted. Ria, you're still muted. You still unmute.
Ta-da!
There we go.
So I had sent you a question, and I wondered if your thoughts had changed at all over the years on targeted assassinations.
Okay. Difficult question. It really is over all the years. I mean, you can go all the way back, and I just looked at that and studied that for the book that I'm slowly writing. So you can go back to the assassination of Ayush and Mohammed Ayush by Paris right after the Rabin assassination. And you can look at the attempted assassinating Meshal in Jordan by Netanyahu. There were successful ones, there were less successful ones. I think there's some people that are not replaceable, and there's some people it just doesn't really make a difference. I think in wartime, I have no problem with it. In other words, targeting death makes perfect sense. He's a wartime commander, in the same way that the United States targeted Yamamoto during World War II. There was a special attempt, and he was on a flight in the Pacific somewheres, and Americans sent fighter jets to down his plane. He was considered, the most brilliant of the Japanese admirals. You can't replace a brilliant person easily. You can't replace a charismatic leader easily. If Hitler had been assassinated at some point, then things might have been very different. There was no one who could have stepped in Hitler's shoes that would have been as effective as he was as a leader. Now, I'm against assassinations in any sort of way, in any sort of time, in time of peace. You don't have a war. I mean, God forbid someone had assassinated Trump last week, there would have been practically a civil war in the United States. And not to mention, it's a terrible thing to do that. But in the middle of a war situation where those people are physically attacking, killing you, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it needs to be used judiciously. Because, what are we going to say? We shouldn't kill death. He doesn't deserve to die. And as to collateral damage, again, we get back to what I discussed about the Yemenites. This whole war has been problematic. It's been problematic on two fronts. First of all, when we started the war, we were causing more collateral damage than we needed to cause. I think part of that was we were angry, but part of that was because we were afraid. And we were afraid that our troops weren't going to know how to maneuver in urban areas, and the casualties would be very high. We didn't realize that our tanks and our armored vehicles were as effective as they ended up being in this war. And so therefore, as soon as we saw any sort of threat, we took down that threat, and who cares how many civilians died while we took down that threat. Now, anyone who's a parent or who's a soldier themselves in Gaza says, yes, that's what you should do. And to some extent, there's truth to that. I was actually listening to a podcast with a former Army prosecutor, currently a civilian lawyer, talking about that this morning. And he talked about the difference between civilian deaths in the chaos of war as opposed to civilian deaths when there's a lot less chaos. And what he said, and it's true, is that in the middle of warfare, in the middle, basically allowed to make mistakes, right? I mean, you see something, it's a threat. There may or may not be civilians, but you're an immediate threat, so you take it down because you're protecting your own soldiers. You don't have time to look at the pros and cons and whether it pays or doesn't pay to do that. The assassination of Death, for instance, was a different sort of scenario where we had time. We didn't have time at that particular second, but from what I understand, we had for half a day planes in the air 24/7, but 12 for 12 hours, there were planes circling Khan Yunis with munitions, ready to attack the house where Def appeared in, because we knew that he was going to appear, and to make sure he didn't get away, we literally cut the period of time to 2 minutes. There were planes ready on a 2-minute period of time to attack that house. Now, before they made the decision to do that, obviously they took into account how many civilians had been killed. Now, it's quite clear that the numbers that were given initially were completely false. I'm sure there were a couple of children in the house, no doubt, but this was not it was a house not in a civilian area. And the big area was civilian, but it was a house all by itself in the middle of a grove of trees. And whoever was in the house got killed, and I'm sure parts of their various terrorist families were there. But the target was a high enough value that even under the laws of international laws of war, you're allowed to have, it's considered collateral damage if terrorists are sitting amongst civilians and you want to kill them. So I don't know if I answered your question. For instance, I remain against the whole thing where we blow up a terrorist's house, the family of a terrorist. I don't think it does anything. All of the studies showed that it really didn't do anything to stop terrorists from doing terrorist acts, but it made everyone feel good, so that we blew up their homes and everyone can say, "Oh, look, we blew up their homes." Okay, that's one way of getting revenge, even after the person may have been killed or not killed. So I don't know if I've answered, but that's. Anyone else?
Wow, he usually has a million questions. Oops, I'm not muted.
No one has questions. This really? What? Okay, I've been instructed to fill the time a little more, which I will for 2 minutes. Maybe still don't have a question. Today, the draft notices went out to the ultra Orthodox, to the first 1,000. The goal is to send out 3,000 over the next 2 or 3 weeks. The hope is that a lot of them will decide to go and not go with what their rabbis are telling them. The rabbis are telling them to ignore it. It's being sent to ultra-Orthodox single men between the ages of 18 and 22, I think it is. They are either working and or have driver's licenses. So these are people who are a little bit less in the yeshiva world. The hope is that they will meet, will get these, and they'll actually decide to go. Some of them have been interviewed. It's not quite clear what they're going to do. Some of them are afraid of being draft evaders. If you don't go, you won't be able to leave the country. There are all sorts of other consequences, financially and otherwise. The rabbi is actually most upset about those kids going, because those are the ones they consider the ones that are already slightly out of the yeshiva world, and they're afraid they're going to the army. They're even going to be more out of the yeshiva world, or out of their control. So we'll see what happens in the next week or two as this develops. Sharon just asked me a question. I think whether I think that Netanyahu is going to meet Trump. Okay, so the story here is he's trying to meet Trump. A little bit, initially people thought it would be problematic if he met Trump in terms of the timing. It's probably not, it's not accepted necessarily in the diplomatic speak, and especially since he should be concerned about the Democrats, because he has the Republicans in his pocket, so to speak. It's not clear Trump wants to meet with him. That's also unclear. He's trying to set up a meeting. He's leaving a day later because he was supposed to meet with Biden tomorrow, but because of COVID, the meeting has been put off until Tuesday. So he's leaving tomorrow morning, and he'll meet with Biden on Tuesday afternoon, and then speak in Congress on Wednesday. He's supposed to return to Israel in the middle of the night on Friday. It's his son's birthday on Friday, and he's down in Miami, so that would be an excuse to go down to Florida and meet Trump in Mar-a-Lago. Who knows? This whole trip, it's not clear to what he's trying to accomplish in the trip, other than it looks good, He still thinks he has a political future here, despite what I gave you in that timeline. He still thinks he has a political future here. I've not met any political junkie or correspondent or anything else who actually thinks that's the case. But if Biden can think he could still run, then Trump could still think that he could still win an election here. Netanyahu could think he'd win an election here too. So anything is possible. Anybody else?
Question.
Bonnie?
Yes, thank you. On a different subject, your dispatches, your diary on the 17th and 18th had a lot of information about I guess it was the Shorish Institute or whatever, doing demographics. And I don't remember all the details except that I was scared by them because it sounds really bad. And I wanted to know, I realize obviously it's wartime, so I don't think people are focusing on that at all. But what is your perception as to whether people understand what's happening in terms of, losing population economically and for all the other reasons of going way right?
So it comes up again and again, if you know, in waves. Obviously, during the war, it didn't on one level, but then it has very much so because of the issue of the ultra-Orthodox draft. So their large increase in the population and their unwillingness to be drafted in the army obviously collides with Israel's need theoretically for a larger army. So that has brought the issue more to the forefront. The statistics in the Shorish study were, very frightening, no question about it. I'm going to try, hopefully next week, to do an interview with the person who put it together. I was offered that, and I'll reach out to him and then post it as part of the update. I heard him on a podcast in Hebrew, and he was quite convincing. I'm afraid it was, that's why I decided to find the report and post it after listening to him on a podcast. Look, it's an inherent big problem in this country that there's no easy solution to. The solutions are economic, obviously. If we stopped giving child support to anything beyond the third or fourth kid, that would have an impact. As a matter of fact, it did when Netanyahu became finance minister for the first time. He changed the economic incentives, and the number of children per family dropped by 1 in a matter of 4 years. So clearly, economics can have a major role in changing the number of kids that a family has. It's happening to some extent as more and more of the families are dependent on the women working. And so, as we know, when women work, there's a disincentive to have too many children. Let's put it that way. As long as they work as teachers in the community, it doesn't make a big difference. But as more and more of them have worked outside the community, and some have gone into high tech even and things of that nature, that's had an impact. But realistically, the numbers really have to go down. There's an overall problem in this country that relates to the fact that, post-Holocaust, we said, they've killed 6 million. We have to have lots of kids. We have to make up for it and all those sort of things. All that's true up to a certain extent. But, when I was growing up, the country had 3 million people. 3 million people seems like a really small country. We're now at 10 million. We're not talking about the Palestinians in the West Bank. We're not talking about Gaza. 10 million people within the pre-67 borders, plus I assume the settlements in Israel, which is the size of Sweden, Norway, normal size European countries, not large countries, but normal size countries. And we're a pretty small country. So it's okay that our numbers level off. Can we get the Haredi world to level off? Maybe. I'll throw in something else, which complicates things so much more. We're in the age of the AI, right? So the age of AI, if you extrapolate further what AI is capable of doing, we're going to need less workers. So maybe we'll have a lot of robots doing all sorts of work, and everyone can go study Talmud because, what the heck, we go all sit there and push 2 buttons, and there you go, the work is done. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not completely. There clearly is going to be a need for less people in doing a lot of jobs. So maybe we won't need as many people. So maybe a smaller number of people will be able to provide for the whole country. One of the problems, of course, with AI and all of that, leaving aside just in Israel, is greater concentration of wealth amongst the wealthy. But maybe if we have a reasonable tax policy, that'll work here as well, or the wealthy will leave here and then we'll have a real problem. So I don't have all the answers. It is frightening, there's no question about it. I have friends who will have a long discussion, and then the end of the whole discussion, they'll basically say the Israeli term that Yitzhak Rabin hated, which is "Yeh beseder," it'll be okay. And then I have other friends, I'll have a long discussion and say, what are we going to do now? There's no good solution for any of this. So one has to be optimistic. I don't go by "Yeh beseder." We all have to do our part to try to make it beseder. And if we're not doing our part, we should do our part, because it won't become beseder just by itself. This country's challenges were multiple before October 7th. They've now increased by some degree that I don't like thinking about often, but that's where it stands. Anyone
Thank
else?
you. Yeah.
Who? Okay, so we don't have anybody else. That's last call. I'll just make one comment personally. I am going to be in the States to speak in Elmira, New York, of all places, on September 9th, which is the only fixed day. Obviously, I'm going mostly to see my grandkids. However, my dates are somewhat flexible. So if you belong to any shul or JCC or something else that's looking for a speaker around that date, I will be in the States, and I encourage anybody who has people who want me to speak. I'll be happy to do so. My only fixed date, like I said, is September 9th. And from there, I will not make my air reservations for another couple of weeks until see what happens. In any case, I'm sure we will get together again in 2 weeks, because things won't be over. Wait, Lisa Ader just asked a question, so go ahead. Oh, wait, she had in the chat, so sorry. Let me just check the chat.
I know also that report said that the math scores were low, which seems to be at odds with, Israel being an AI, powerhouse. So can you speak to that at all?
Okay, the math scores, I'm not sure which math scores are low. They're particularly low amongst the population. Again, remember something. The people who are in the high-tech industries, all of them, or 90% of them, come out of the elite tech units of the Israeli Army, Air Force, etc. The Israeli Army, etc. Every student, and this is one of the reasons why universal draft is so important in Israel. The universal draft, and leaving aside the Haredim for a section, basically every high school student signs up. All his school scores are known by the Army. They take a series of tests when they go to their first induction call at the induction centers, and then based on the various Nitunim, the various scores, the very, very best, and if they're best physically as well, get invited to try out for pilots course. And by the way, the reason Israel has the best pilots in the world is twofold. One, they get to take from the whole population, and then they pick the best kids in the whole population, men and women. They get the best ones. They get to test them. They get to test them, including in a simulator. And if they passed all of those things, then they can go on to flight school, which is a 3-year school, which includes a degree. But only 1 out of the 10 who start end up finishing. So just figure out how many filters they have to go through to become a pilot in the Israeli Air Force, and then only less than half of them become fighter pilots, and the others become transport pilots or helicopter pilots, which are considered a little less challenging. So that's the reason Israel has the best pilots. But I'm digressing slightly. The people who are not qualified to be pilots or don't make the cut are then given additional tests, and those people end up going to be the tech people in the Israeli Army and Air Force and intelligence and all those things. So basically, the tech forces within the Israeli Army are taken from the very top kids in the country. And then they spend 5 years usually, sometimes a little bit less, but they spend 5 years in their profession intensively, first being trained and then working intensively in their profession and things that they would never be able to do in the outside world. And then they get out of there and either get hired or start their own companies. You don't need a lot of them to create the startup nation. You don't need a lot of them to be the AI force in the world, although we're not really the number one in AI for a whole bunch of reasons. So that's why we can do that. So hold on. So that's the answer. I see Daniel Jacobs is asking a question. I don't know. There's a dear Mark there. So if you have a question, you want to say it orally, fine. If not, there's no question in my chat. So okay, I guess not. Okay, everybody. I thank you all again. We will meet again in 2 weeks. Until then, have good 2 weeks, and I hope we all stay safe.